Have you ever spent a lot of time in the practice room trying to memorize a new piece of music and then not be able to recall most of what you tried to memorize the next day? I know, that is super frustrating. So the question is, what are we doing wrong in the memorization process that's keeping us from retaining and recalling our information efficiently? Well, it turns out there are 11 reasons backed by science that can explain why this happens and that can help us fix this problem for good. Before I jump into these strategies, I want to start by recommending a couple of really amazing resources for memorization strategies. The first of which is this awesome book called Make It Stick by authors Peter Brown and then researchers Henry Roediger and Mark McDaniel. This book is a super fun read. It's going to cover a lot of the memorization strategies that I will talk about in this video. It's really easy to understand and has a lot of great stories. I would recommend this not just for music practice, but for anything that you want to learn and memorize. This is the kind of book that I wish I had when I was in high school. So if you have kids, get this book for them, make it mandatory reading. Again, it's called Make It Stick, and I have a link for that book in the description below. The second resource is going to be Noah Kageyama's blog called The Bulletproof Musician. I mentioned Noah Kageyama in my last video on practice strategies that you can check out at the end of this video. His blog is awesome. It has a lot of memorization strategies, practice strategies, and one of the best things about his blog is that it covers a lot of performance anxiety. So, a lot of musicians have stage fright, and he goes through strategies and even a whole course that I highly recommend that can help you combat that. So definitely check out Noah Kageyama's blog, The Bulletproof Musician. Again, the link is in the description below. Okay, let's jump right in, but make sure to stick around to the end because I do have a bonus tip that could positively or negatively affect your memorization strategies depending on how you deal with it. The most important thing to understand for any memorization strategy is that in the learning process, you already have to have an intention to memorize the music. In other words, when you're reading your music, don't just think about reading the music, you really want to think about trying to memorize what you're reading. That intention needs to be present for any strategy to work, so please keep that in mind when you're listening to the rest of the strategies in this video. The first reason why you may not be able to memorize your music efficiently could be because you're not listening to your music enough before sitting down to learn it. In this article cited by Noah Kageyama, researchers suggest that listening to a piece of music before attempting to learn it can significantly accelerate the memorization process of a piece. So think about it on a personal level. If you listen to a piece of music, whether it's a piece of music that you want to learn or maybe a pop tune, if you listen to it over and over again, you're eventually going to memorize the melody. You may even start humming the melody. So once you get to that point, you already know the tune. So once you do that, it's going to be a faster memorization process just because you're already comfortable with the piece. The second reason you may not be able to memorize your music efficiently could be because you're using too much serial practice and not enough chunking and chaining. So serial practice is basically when you try to learn a piece from the top and you run through it until you make a mistake, and then once you hit that mistake, you go back to the very beginning and keep using that loop process to try to get through the piece. So a better approach to that is chunking and chaining, and there are two ways that you can do this. One of them is called additive practice, and the other one is called holistic practice. Again, there's a great article that Noah Kageyama cites that talks about these things in depth. Additive chaining is basically when you take a phrase of music that makes some kind of musical sense, and then you start to add chunks to that. So you memorize this chunk of music, and then you're going to add maybe a measure or two measures to that, and you keep chaining them in an additive manner until you get through the whole piece. So the only problem with additive practice is that it only works when you do the retrieval process immediately after you learn it. So if you take it out of context or if you have some kind of interruption, it's not going to work very well. So there's another kind of practice called holistic practice where you take larger segments of music and you run through them. When you make an error, you back up just a tiny bit and then try to go through the error again. So what I like to do is to combine them, especially when I have more complex pieces. Instead of trying to get through the whole piece with this holistic manner, I'll get through a larger phrase of music, again, with the intention of memorizing it. When I run into an error, I will back up a little bit, but I'm gonna do that using a combination of additive and holistic practice. So again, I'll let you read more about that in the blog post from Noah Kageyama that I have linked below. The third reason is that you may not be using mnemonics in your practice. And in music practice, there are 4 kinds of mnemonics that work very well. These are called performance cues. There's technical cues, structural cues, expressive cues, and interpretive cues. Basically, the way that they work is if you have sheet music, you can write down each of these cues in your practice while you're learning them. So if it's a technical thing, you could say, for example, I have a scale where I use picados, so I could write down scale, relax the picados. If it's a structural cue, it's about the form of the music. Okay, I'm gonna just scan through the music. This is the A section that repeats, so I can write down at the end of the first repeat section, make sure to repeat, things like that. Expressive cues are where you put in your own artistry, your own musicality and personality into the music. Maybe you want to change the tone for a particular section. You can write down, for example, more mysterious, more melancholic, darker sound, anything that helps you think about it on basically a more emotional level, and that I find helps me the most. And then the last one are interpretive cues, and this is often written into the piece. These could be, for example, just dynamic markers, and you can memorize those. For example, if there's a section that has a big crescendo, you remember, oh, this is the section with the crescendo. The fourth reason is not using enough space practice. So the intuitive approach for a lot of people is to practice a phrase, to learn a phrase, and then just loop it over and over and over again, hoping that that's gonna set. It just doesn't work according to all the research. Instead of repeating over and over again, practice your phrase, take a little break, a couple seconds, think about it, do it again. Space out your practice sessions so you have some time in between to assimilate the information, to rest your muscles, rest your brain, and of course, make sure you're getting enough sleep. So all of these things help consolidate and reconsolidate the information. Again, all of that is going to be in the video that I made previously. Reason number 5 is using too much blocked practice. So blocked practice is basically when you repeat a particular task over and over and over and over again, making sure that you got that really down before you move on to the next. So let's say, for example, in terms of time, we've got 3 sections of music that we want to play, and we're going to spend 15 minutes on each section. So 15 minutes on A, 15 on B, 15 on C. That doesn't seem to work very well according to all the research. In the initial stages of learning, when we do a little bit of block practice, but we want to get out of that pretty quickly and move to what's called interleaved practice. So instead of spending 15 on A, then B, then C in each block, we're going to still spend 15 minutes on A, B, and C, but we're going to do it in 3 sets of 5 minutes. So for example, 5 minutes on A, 5 on B, 5 on C, and then we repeat that 3 times. So at the end of the day, we've still spent 15 minutes on A, then on B, and on C, but we've done it in an interleaved manner. So the nice thing about this is that it incorporates space practice, which we've already shown helps memorization, and then of course the interleave factor of doing 3 different things is going to help you force your recall a little bit more, which is going to help improve your memorization. Number 6 is not using enough variable practice when we sit down to play music. Intuitively, it kind of makes sense not to do that. If you think, I have a task, if I do it the same way a bunch of times, then I'm really honing in on what I need to do and it's going to get better. But according to research, that doesn't work very well, and the best thing to do is to create slight variations of the task that you're doing in order to improve not just the memorization of that task, but also the motor skills. You can do this by changing your volumes, changing your tempo, your rhythm, your color tone, I mean, just a bunch of different things. You can even change your posture a little bit. There are lots of little nuanced ways that you can use to add variability that are quite simple and make, I think, practice a lot more fun as well. Number 7 is not using elaboration in your practice. And what that means in a nutshell is that when you learn a phrase, you may not be elaborating on what you've just learned in terms of how it relates to anything else you've done in the past musically, or maybe even experientially. Personally, I find that when I elaborate on a phrase, it helps me most when I can relate it to some kind of emotion. Number 8 is not using reflection in your practice. And all that means is that you may not be analyzing what you've just done before you do another repetition. So like I mentioned before, an intuitive approach to music is to repeat a particular phrase over and over again, hoping that that's going to help it stick in memory and hoping that that's also going to help improve the technique. All the research points to the exact opposite, so that really doesn't make much of a difference. It really only helps for stamina. So what you do instead is do what I mentioned before in my other video. You can use mini breaks to help you do a quick couple-second analysis on whether or not the phrase that you played was right, whether it was wrong, whatever. Just make sure that you analyze. Always stop to analyze your phrases after every 1 to 2 repetitions instead of just rapid firing them. Number 9 is not using calibration in your practice. That just basically means adjustments or corrections to what you've already analyzed previously. So it's one thing to analyze it and say, it was wrong, let me try it again. And then it's another thing to say, it's wrong because my second finger was too high, let me make an adjustment or calibration and lower it and then try it again. Reason number 10 is not using what's called generation. Basically, it means you're not generating your own possible solutions to the errors or the challenge spots that you're running into. What you want to try to do is try to come up with, think about 7 possible solutions to an error that you're running into before you give up and before you ask your teacher. Obviously, I mentioned, don't just loop things, just eliminate that option. That's not an option anymore. But at least 7 possible solutions. Likely you're gonna get to 3 and you'll find a solution. And if you don't, by the time you get to 7, that's when you can ask your teacher. Reason number 11 is retrieval practice. In other words, testing yourself often. So the first thing that I think is important to understand is that when you start to learn a piece of music, you want to do so with the intention of memorizing the piece of music. Not just, for example, if you have sheet music, not just playing through it over and over again, but really try to have an intention to memorize it. For example, if you're working with sheet music, you can memorize your first musical phrase this way. Let's say your phrase is 2 measures long. Read through it, but with the intention of memorizing that phrase, not just reading it, but really trying to memorize it. Once you read through it, turn your sheet music over and try to recall that information from memory. Try to play it on your instrument from memory. It's going to be very challenging, but that's totally the point. The higher the effort of recall is, the more likely that information will get encoded into long-term memory. So I generally recommend for myself and for my students to try 3 recall attempts from memory, By the third time, if you get it, that's awesome. Then I like to do an extra one just to validate it. If you don't get it, turn the sheet music over, take a look at the part that you've forgotten, that you couldn't get. And then once you figure that out, turn the sheet music back over again so you can't see it, and try the same process, another 3 attempts. And just keep using that process throughout your music. That's gonna be the best way to do it, the best way to increase your effort of recall and get the memorization working for you. So here's the bonus reason, number 12. Research shows that stress can significantly disrupt the memorization process. When you sit down to practice, I think the first thing that we want to do is to eliminate the musical stress part of this whole stress world, right? Don't be in a hurry. We don't need to prove anything. We don't need to be faster. We don't need to get it sooner. Just enjoy it. And I think that's the thing that I found most helpful, is to really be in the moment for the right reason. And the right reason is why you got into music to begin with. Why did we get into music? Most of us got into it because of how music made us feel. It was a very positive thing. And I think that even if we're practicing technique, we want to think about that positive thing. We want to think about how the sound of the instrument that we're playing makes us feel. So I would focus on that. Focus on lowering the musical stress first, right? There's just no reason to have musical stress. If something's not working, don't worry about it. Don't try not to get frustrated. Easier said than done. Think about correcting your errors. Think about how this is just a long-term thing. It's consistency. Try to have fun. Make sure that you're enjoying the sound of it. Other stressors that in life, you have to really do your best to put them aside for your music practice. They'll be there, don't worry. You don't have to think about them during practice. They'll be there afterwards. But in your music practice, make sure you're focusing on reducing stress, enjoying the music, and making improvements. There's actually a bonus solution to the stress problem, which is retrieval practice. Research shows that retrieval practice can significantly reduce the effects of stress on long-term memory. So this is just another reason to make sure that you're using retrieval practice, testing yourself often, turning the music over, trying to recall it from memory all the time when you sit down to practice. That said, if you want your practice to be as efficient as possible so that you can become a better musician in terms of memorization, technique, expression, and performance, then you definitely should check out the next video in the practice strategy series that is up on the screen right now. So thank you so much, and I'll see you over there.